In late June, 70 researchers and farmers took part in a WA Livestock Research Council by invitation study tour to the UWA Research Farm in West Pingelly. On site, they were treated to a broad range of presentations that provided an insight into the extent of projects underway and the degree of collaboration between WA's livestock research community. As our day draws to a close at Ridgefield, Kevin Foster from DPIRD talks to us about pasture renovation studies, identifying and using the new ute-guide.
It was really needed. I mean, going back to 2016, samples are coming through at UWA in our glasshouse, and a lot of the samples were coming through from random pasture samples, so it wasn't targeted. A lot of them were estrogenic clover. So part of the problem is that we had forgotten the whole issue about estrogenic clover. It sort of dropped off the radar for decades. So for those who aren't familiar with estrogenic clover, in these plants in front of me, these are picked up from a paddock down south, and these contain mostly dinner nut. So estrogenic clover, we've known about since the 1940s, and when we released our sub-clovers in WA, unfortunately 4 of the 5 sub-clovers were released in WA at that time contained high levels of estrogenic compound. At that time, we didn't know what the compound was. So consequently, we weren't screening like Phil Nichols showed you earlier today. Phil goes through there now and screens all the clovers. That's part of our standard procedure. Ironically, it's our cheapest and most easiest test. In the 1940s, we didn't know what it was. Fast forward to the 1960s, and we identified the compound as being formaminotin, or F, to make it simple. Unfortunately, all those clovers were already been sown through southwest WA and in the eastern states because we exported our seed. So the issue was that before we had a chance to do any screening, we'd already sowed tens, thousands, hundreds of thousands of hectares of estrogenic clover right through southern Australia. And when the new program came along, like Phil Nichols is doing now, when we started to release new clovers, we thought with the release of new low formaminotin clovers that the problem was resolved, right? It's gone. We thought there'd be high adoption of the new clovers, and for many years, we just presumed that it had gone away. And now people are saying, oh, there's been a resurgence of estrogenic clover. There's no resurgence, it's just never gone away. It's just we have failed to understand and see and look for it. And the problem is that the skills that we used to have, and used to teach at universities, and consultants used to have, and in my own departments used to have, and within the seed industry, all those skills are pretty much gone. There's been a generational change, and we have to go back now and re-educate and teach, and that includes at our universities, seed industry people, about what estrogenic clovers are and what impact they can have. So for those, this is what permanent infertility is, clover disease. It's an umbrella term that's been used since the 1940s. So it includes a whole range of disorders. So dystocia, which we talked about earlier today, right? Prolapse of the uterus, increased vaginal prolapses, even in unmated ewes, stillbirths, so lambs can die in utero, masculinized genitalia on ewes, glandular abnormalities, and in wethers this can lead to false bladder, which means they have this big pouch underneath here, and in wethers when it's really bad, the teats start to grow and they'll actually produce milk. And when it's really bad on the shearing floor, there'll be milk on the floor. So it tells you what impact estrogenic clovers can have. And then it dramatically reduces fertility, and then you get lactation in maiden ewes as well. And as I said, in wethers you get this yellow viscous milk. There's another thing too. So that's clover disease. That's generally, the more exposure the animals get, becomes permanent. So permanent infertility. The other thing that can happen too is temporary infertility, whereas the animals are put on it for a short period of time, maybe prior to mating. They'll go on estrogenic clover, and then it takes about 4 to 6 weeks for them to come off that before they become fertile again. So you've got 2 sorts of the disease. You've got the permanent and you've got the temporary. If the animals come off within 4 to 6 weeks, they're normally okay. So what we did is we had 2 phases to our project. The first phase of the project was, if you like, to convince MLA and others, including my own university, to fund this work. So the first phase was about going off and seeing farmers, walking the paddocks and getting samples back at UWA. The other thing that happened too was because we thought the problem was resolved, the Isoflavone Lab at UWA, which we used to use to screen the plants. We can clip these leaves, so we can do a visual ID, and then what we can do is we can take a leaf, we clip that leaf, and we can tell in the green leaf what the estrogenic content is. And if it's above a certain level, we consider it to be unsafe. That lab closed, and it closed for 20 years. The end result was that consultants, farmers, researchers didn't have that facility anymore to be able to test the paddocks. So you can see why there's been a knowledge gap, and there's no central place to report it as well. Because it all closed, there's no one else around there to actually collect the data and actually be able to visually ID what these clovers were. So we sent out all these kits across southern Australia through grow groups and through ourselves and through the mail. We sent out about 300 of them. And they came back, some came back with multiple samples in them. And this sample you can see down here is one that came back. This is one of the bad clovers. This is called dinner nut, which I'll show you in a minute. So the upshot of all of this was, after 2 years of sending out free sampling kits, all the producers got this sample sheet. It was all free, all paid for. They sent it back to the lab, and then we gave them a result. We told them what clover they had, and we told them if it was estrogenic or not. So all those producers got that information, and then they can start acting on it if they had to. And we gave them a little clover ID, so they could go to their own paddocks and work out whether they had it or not. So that was been a fantastic extension tool. It helped raise the awareness right through southern Australia. We ended up talking to, over the period of 4 years, Joe was our program manager for MLA. Over 4 years, we interacted with 975 producers, didn't quite make 1,000. About 300 of these samples. Of the 600 that we tested, 60% of those samples came back above what we considered to be safe. 70% of the producers that we spoke to, when they filled out this survey sheet, we asked them, when's the last time you replaced your clovers in your paddocks? When's the last time you renovated? 70% of those farmers came back and said in the last 25 years they have not done it. If you have not replaced your pasture in the last 25 years, the chances of you having an estrogenic clover is high. So consequently, that's why these farmers are experiencing issues, is because they haven't replaced it with a low estrogen fulminant type plant. And hence why we have this renovation program going on here now. So this was very illuminating because it confirmed in the phase 1 that we had an issue, and then the phase 2 issue involved renovation as well, and also extending out the message even further. So what was the end result? It's quite illuminating to say the least. We ended up, after producing, sending out all the samples across southern Australia, we came up with a Seedling Id Tool. This is what we really needed, because for the farmers to be able to get in the paddock and actually ID some of these clovers, some of them are so closely similar that not even the seed industry guys can separate them apart. So we knew for them to be able to be separated out in the seed industry, we had to come up with a new tool. So we came up, and I'll pass this around. So that's to organ up sub-clover, which is almost identical to Dalkeith sub-clover. And the seed industry couldn't separate these out. So what the problem was is that we were releasing, sometimes the farmers were buying new seed lots. This is uncertified seed we're talking about. Some were buying uncertified seed, and some of that seed was actually containing estrogenic clover because we couldn't tell them apart. So part of our issue, part of our approach was to actually get on and come up with some new seedling tools so we could separate out those clovers so that there wasn't more inflow. Because if you're growing new clovers out here and then you're sowing the problem again, if you've got estrogenic clover in your seed and it's uncertified and that's going back out again, we found in our clovers, we found up to 30 to 40% of the clovers that were being sown were estrogenic again. So the seed industry couldn't tell them apart, but now some of these more problematic clovers they actually can. The other thing that was really interesting too was that a lot of the clovers that came back, the clovers that we thought might be low in fulminant, things like trichala, when they came back, when trichala was put in areas where it might have been under phosphorus stress or waterlogging stress, they came back. When we isoflavone sampled the leaves, it was much higher than we expected. So we believe that even though trichala has been released and it's been released for decades and it's safe, under certain circumstances, some of the safer clovers now, under nutrition or waterlogging, can actually become, the actual isoflavone levels in the green leaves can actually rise and they can actually become unsafe. So the lesson for that is that when we test our clovers from now on, what we should be doing is actually testing them also in the field under real life conditions, so that if they do experience those conditions, that we do know what the F level is actually going to be in the green plant. Because if we test them in a situation where they're in a common garden and then we release them, that may not be representative of what's actually happening in the field. The other problem is that many farmers who do renovate with new clovers, the first time they renovate, they fail. The reason they fail is because they don't control. There's a large seed bank of seed. You have clover growing for a few years, especially estrogenic clovers. They grow for a few years, then you get the seed bank building up. And when that builds up, you go in there to sow your new clover, and you've got 300 kilograms behind you, or 400, and you go and sow your 5 or 10 kilograms of seed into that without controlling the seed, without reducing the seed bank, then unfortunately you're going to fail. And we found a lot of farmers were sending us samples in where they'd sowed a new sub-clover, and yet we couldn't find it in our samples after a few years. And that's simply because the seed bank of the old clover is so high and so persistent and so competitive that the new sub-clover that you plant in at a lower seeding rate won't be successful. So these renovation plots here were either cropped for 4 years or sown pasture on pasture. And when we did this pasture on pasture here, no matter how much we double knocked and what we did, we still couldn't get rid of all the estrogenic clover in that system. And that's what many farmers are doing. They're going sowing pasture on pasture. In our cropping phase here, where we controlled the clovers within the crop, we got that 250 kilograms seed bank down to 9 kilos in 4 years. And that's successful. And we can sow it, you can walk in that now and have a look, and you'll see that the clover that we planted is actually there. So if you like, the next part of the project we need to do is we need to have facilitated extension work with farmers to teach them how to do successful renovation, because it's a very expensive business and you only want to do it once and get it right. So this has taught us a lot about the correct methodology, which is in that ute-guide book as well. And so hopefully the next project, the next phase will be all about renovation work. But we've already shown now we can successfully do it. This place has got quite a good burden of estrogenic clover in the background, and we've managed to get that right down now by doing a series of golden rules, if you like. 4 bad clovers. So this is Yarloop. You won't see that here. Didnut, you'll see that here. And these are the ones that were sown, that have been released for decades, and unfortunately are very persistent in our system. The other 2 that you'll see, both of these are on the farm as well as Didnut. Is that Dwarganup and Geraldton. So if you walk out in that paddock out there, you'll probably find all these as well. Especially in this raceway between them, less so in the 2 paddocks we've renovated, but we haven't got rid of all the clover, just the majority of it, enough for it to be safe now.